Immediately vying for central control, d4 establishes a solid pawn presence, opening diagonals for future development. Developing a knight to its optimal outpost anticipates central control and offers dynamic counterplay. Boldly seizing central space, c pushes to contest the d-pawn and establish a formidable pawn phalanx. Embracing the dragon, black prepares to fianchetto their bishop, creating potential diagonal pressure and a solid defensive pawn structure. Building central pawn structure, preparing kingside castling while restricting black's fianchetto development. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies black's control over the long diagonal and prepares for potential pawn breaks while maintaining king's safety. Establishing a powerful pawn center, 4e4 immediately stakes a claim to crucial central squares and prepares to launch a central pawn storm. Reinforcing the center and preparing to challenge white's pawn on e4, this development also opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, adding pressure to white's central control. Fortifying the king, f3 sacrifices central control and may prematurely weaken the e4 pawn's defense. Securing the monarch from imminent threats, this castling initiates a safer, more robust defensive posture against white's central pawn ambitions. Solidifying the center and preparing for a kingside pawn storm, this move, b3, subtly positions the bishop to support e4 and potentially eye the kingside. It's a move that prioritizes king's safety and a controlled expansion, signaling white's intention to slowly build an advantageous pawn structure while keeping options open for a later kingside attack. The bishop's new diagonal offers defensive capabilities and could participate in future tactical exchanges. Preparing for a queenside expansion, this move subtly curbs white's potential knight outpost on b5 and creates a safe haven for the queen, should the queenside become a battleground. Preparing to contest the central squares and potentially launch a kingside attack, this knight maneuver aims to support the e4 pawn and keep options open for further development, perhaps towards the kingside if black commits to a particular pawn structure, or even a central break if the opportunity arises. Developing the knight to its natural square fortifies the central pawn chain and prepares for further piece activity, potentially eyeing the e4 pawn or supporting a kingside advance. Preparing to exert pressure on the queenside, the rook embarks on a journey to its formidable semi-open file, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious setup and probe for weaknesses around the monarch. Developing the bishop to d7 initiates a subtle repositioning, preparing to contest the central e4 pawn and potentially support a future b5 advance, aiming to loosen white's grip on the queenside. Pivoting the queen to the d2 square initiates a sophisticated kingside expansion, preparing for a potential pawn storm with g4, while simultaneously reinforcing the e4 pawn's defense and clearing the way for the f-pawn's forward march. Preparing to challenge white's central pawns with a pawn storm or perhaps intending to create a queenside springboard for the knight, black's rook anchors itself to the semi-open file, ready to become an active participant in the coming struggle for territory. Shifting the knight to d1 offers a fluid regrouping, aiming to redeploy it to better squares like f2 or e3, potentially supporting a central pawn push or reinforcing the kingside defense. This maneuver also prepares to unblock the queen's diagonal, adding another layer to white's strategic positioning. It's a quiet, preparatory move, setting the stage for future developments rather than dictating immediate action. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, this frees up the knight on f6 to potentially join the kingside defense or even participate in a future central break. Unleashing a knight's potential, the dual kingside targeting begins as the knight abandons its passive role on the third rank, setting up a potential leap to g4 to harass black's kingside pawn structure. Black's flank expansion on the queenside immediately challenges white's space advantage, aiming to pry open the b-file and potentially create attacking chances against white's potentially exposed king. Cracking open the queenside pawn chain with c5 unleashes a territorial ambition, aiming to sever black's central influence and potentially establish a dominant queenside presence for white, though it simultaneously weakens the d4 square and demands careful prophylaxis against black's counterplay on the queenside itself. Opening a diagonal for the bishop and inviting tactical fireworks, this capture immediately disrupts white's pawn structure. Black gambits central space for dynamic piece play, hoping to exploit the weakened light squares around white's king and potentially generate counterplay on the queen side. The position becomes sharper, forcing both players to calculate precisely as pawn tension dissolves and pieces are activated. Reclaiming the open file with the rook offers a powerful central presence, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and demanding a defensive response. Liberating the bishop and aiming for queenside counterplay are the core ideas behind this central pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's cramped position and create dynamic possibilities. Unlocking the queenside pawn's latent energy, this advance aims to seize the initiative by creating a forward battery and potentially isolating black's center. Embracing the isolated pawn structure that results from the recent exchanges, black seeks to reposition their knight to a more active square, preparing to contest central control and potentially launch counterplay on the king side or queen side, depending on white's subsequent development. The knight's relocation to c1 is a subtle yet strategically significant maneuver aimed at revitalizing white's position. Instead of passively defending the d5 pawn, this repositioning creates a dynamic possibility to influence the queen side. Notice how it frees up the d2 square, potentially allowing the queen to shift and support a kingside attack or reinforce the d5 outpost. Furthermore, the knight now eyes the b3 square, hinting at a future queenside expansion or a defensive anchor should black attempt to exploit the open c-file. This seemingly unhurried piece movement demonstrates a deep positional understanding, orchestrating a latent threat rather than an immediate assault. Injecting immediate central tension and a bid for queenside expansion, 15. c6 jolts the game's equilibrium, challenging white's entrenched pawn chain and seeking to liberate black's queenside pieces from their passive positions. This move, a forceful thrust, initiates a complex sequence that promises to reshape the battlefield, forcing white to react decisively to a sudden shift in the pawn structure and the newly opened diagonals. The ensuing exchanges will likely determine whether black can achieve the desired active play, or if white's robust central presence will ultimately prove too much to overcome. Unlocking the c-file with this capture decisively seizes control of a key open avenue, promising increased attacking potential and putting significant pressure on black's queenside structure. Reclaiming the central knight opens the door to an improved pawn structure and the potential for active piece play on the queen side. However, the isolated pawn on c6 now becomes a significant target, demanding careful defensive attention. Squeezing the enemy center with a knight's dual-purpose advance, this maneuver simultaneously prepares to reinforce the d5 outpost and potentially launch an attack on the king side if the opportunity arises. Black's rook finds its post on the open file, actively challenging white's central control and preparing to exploit any weakness that arises from white's pawn structure. Bolstering the central pawn chain while preparing to challenge the open c-file and potentially activate the knight on f2 towards more active squares represents a solid positional consolidation, aiming to solidify white's grip on the board's center. Liberating the bishop from its initial shadow, this maneuver seeks to activate the piece on the queen side, potentially targeting the white king's defenses or supporting a future pawn thrust with the c-pawn. Castling now secures the king, but more importantly, it untangles the rooks, preparing them for potential action along the semi-open c-file or the potentially opening e-file. The immediate benefit is connecting the rooks and bringing the h1 rook into play, creating a more cohesive defensive structure and freeing the e-file for future pawn pushes or rook maneuvers, anticipating black's desire to challenge white's central control. A surprising retreat, rerouting the bishop to a defensive square, relinquishing the active diagonal and momentarily conceding space along the king side, but perhaps aiming to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for a potential queenside counterplay or a regrouping maneuver. Shifting the rook to the third rank is a deliberate attempt to bolster the center and potentially eye the vulnerable black kingside pawn structure after the preceding exchanges, while also preparing to contest the open c-file more aggressively. The knight's foray to d4 initiates a fascinating positional duel, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and exploit the potential weaknesses arising from the queenside advance. Black bravely sacrifices material consideration for dynamic play, seeking active piece placement and a tactical imbalance. This bold maneuver could either unravel White's position or lead to a quick counterstrike if Black isn't prepared for the ensuing exchanges. This exchange finally punctures the pawn chain and opens up lines, but at the cost of weakening White's central control and creating a dynamic imbalance where Black's king could become surprisingly exposed despite its castled position. The immediate concession of the knight exchange, while seemingly passive, is a strategic maneuver designed to dislodge White's strong central knight and simplify the board, potentially leading to a more manageable endgame where Black's slightly compromised pawn structure might be less of a hindrance. Exchanging queens here immediately forces a simplified position, likely leading to an endgame where White's slightly better pawn structure on the queen side and open c-file might offer some long-term advantage, though Black's active knight on e7 still poses a direct threat to the uncastled king's protection. Capturing the rook on c3 fundamentally alters the tactical landscape, opening the c-file for Black's remaining rook and demanding immediate attention from White's king, which is now significantly less sheltered. Opening the b-file for the rook offers a new avenue of attack, but it concurrently weakens your queenside pawn structure, leaving the c-pawn isolated and susceptible to future pressure. This decision gambles on immediate dynamic activity outweighing long-term structural integrity, a classic trade-off in chess where one must carefully weigh the potential for tactical fireworks against the solid foundation of positional advantage. Black's bishop pair now becomes more potent as the center opens, and you'll need to be vigilant about defending against their potential breakthroughs. Reclaiming the central dark squares and preparing to challenge the isolated pawn on c3 is the immediate aim as Black repositions their queen for a more active role. Clearing the d-file and setting up a potential rook lift to the third rank, this repositioning of the bishop from its active outpost aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prepare for a more concerted central pawn push or kingside expansion. Reactivating the dark-squared bishop aims to re-establish a presence on the queenside and challenge White's control over the c-file, potentially preparing for nh5 to eye the weak f4 square. White's knight repositions to f3, not for an immediate attack, but to prepare a subtle repositioning, aiming to shift pressure towards Black's queenside pawn structure which, despite its seeming solidity, is vulnerable to well-placed piece pressure. Re-anchoring the bishop to c8 seems passive, a missed chance to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the queen and potentially harass the advanced pawns. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside signals an intent to shatter Black's pawn shield and expose their monarch to the central assault. Targeting the weak d-pawn with the bishop offers Black a chance to consolidate their queenside pressure, but it requires careful maneuvering to avoid immediate counterplay from White's kingside potential. This pawn sacrifice, driven by a desire to pry open the kingside for eventual attack, sacrifices immediate material for dynamic potential, a classic imbalance created by White's pawn push. Pivoting the knight from its passive square, nh5 seeks to redefine its role, perhaps aiming for the g3 outpost or simply to escape the confines of its current setup, injecting dynamism into Black's often static position. Establishing a pawn chain forward to gain central space and support an eventual kingside advance or a central breakthrough. Opening the f-file creates immediate activity, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed White king and create dynamic play along the newly opened diagonal that now connects the queenside pawn majority. The pawn advance cracks open the center, offering a dynamic shift by challenging the bishop and potentially disrupting the knight's defense. Unleashing the queen's power, QC aggressively eyes the weakened kingside pawn structure and aims to coordinate with the rook on the c-file, seeking counterplay amidst the otherwise cramped position. Unlocking the kingside is the clear objective here, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create attacking chances against Black's monarch. Reclaiming central space by opening the king's diagonal presents a significant tactical challenge, forcing a re-evaluation of piece activity and pawn structure. Spotting that vulnerable king, this forces a critical decision, potentially opening lines for attack or allowing for immediate recapture with serious consequences. The king, exposed on its starting square, now faces a precarious retreat to f8, a desperate attempt to escape the immediate firing line of white's advanced pieces. Yet it offers little solace given the open lines and white's clear attacking intentions on the king side. Dislodging the enemy knight from its defensive post now opens a pathway to exploiting the compromised kingside pawn structure. Unleashing a sudden diagonal assault, black aims to disrupt white's consolidated structure by forcing the king into an exposed position, potentially opening lines for further aggressive maneuvers. Unleashing a calculated risk, the king steps into the spotlight, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt the incoming cavalry charge and potentially escape the suffocating queen's onslaught. Seizing the initiative, this audacious queen sacrifice aims to expose white's king, promising a dynamic continuation in the ensuing chaos rather than a positional grind. Disengaging the monarch from the immediate skirmish, this maneuver seeks to establish a secure haven, potentially eyeing a repositioning to g3 or h3, thereby extricating the king from the now open diagonal and the looming threat of the Black Queen's infiltration through the 7th rank. A necessary exchange to simplify a position where white's king looks exposed to further pressure. Securing the king amidst the encroaching darkness of black's forces marks a pivotal moment, forcing white into a more defensive posture, as the remaining material necessitates careful king safety above all else. The bishop lands on a3, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety by exploiting the a3 f8 diagonal, while simultaneously preparing to retreat and regroup if necessary. Securing the king's immediate safety, while repositioning for a more active role in the looming endgame. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active diagonal after the pawn sacrifice and exchange, aiming to pressure the white king's defenses. Activating the rook to the open file, the white king now finds itself in an extremely precarious situation, exposed by the recent pawn advancements and the queen's departure. The knights leap into the enemy's camp, while seemingly aggressive, sacrifices essential defensive coverage of the kingside. Opening the g-file exposes the black king to direct attack, a significant concession that creates immediate and dangerous attacking opportunities for white. Reclaiming the pawn structure, black ignites a desperate counterattack against white's exposed monarch, weaving a tactical web through open lines. This rook push is an attempt to galvanize the remaining pieces and disrupt black's suddenly formidable pawn structure. Unlocking the f-file, black endeavors to bring the rook into the fray, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and exploit any latent weaknesses around the monarch. Unlocking the rook's potential along the 7th rank after that tactical exchange offers a new avenue for pressure, potentially aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's king in the ensuing endgame. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on a more active diagonal provides black with a crucial long-range piece, potentially creating threats against the now exposed white king, or supporting an eventual pawn push to free the remaining minor pieces. Unleashing a pawn thrust to pry open the kingside, threatening to cascade threats down the now exposed f-file and potentially trap black's bishop. The rook's retreat allows it to offer support to the pawn advance, aiming to open lines for the bishop that is currently boxed in. Rescuing the rook from its precarious perch and activating it towards the center is the primary objective now, aiming to create counterplay against black's somewhat exposed king. The rook's relocation to the 6th rank aims to activate it on the open file, but it leaves the pawn on e5 vulnerable and forfeits valuable time that could be used to consolidate the material advantage. Shifting the rook to the open file immediately pressures the pinned knight and seeks to dislodge it, a necessary step to activate white's beleaguered king and explore opportunities for counterplay in this complex endgame scenario. Seizing the opportunity, black snatches an uncontested pawn, yet this opportunistic grab might distract from the crucial task of coordinating forces before white's rooks dominate the central files. Unlocking the king's suffocating confinement on the 7th rank, this pawn's bold advance injects immediate dynamism, forcing a reckoning for the black monarch's exposed position and offering a tantalizing glimpse of decisive action. Pulling the rook back acknowledges the passed pawn's unstoppable march, but also surrenders the crucial f-file initiative white had so painstakingly built. Unlocking the rook's diagonal power, this recapture creates immediate attacking pressure on the isolated black king. Sacrificing the bishop to eliminate white's powerful, passed f-pawn opens up a desperate endgame where black's remaining pieces must work overtime to neutralize the advanced pawn on e5 and the rook's activity, instigating a desperate attempt to disrupt black's encroaching queenside pawn and secure a potentially drawn rook endgame. This move challenges the bishop and forces black to confront the immediate threat to their remaining pawn structure. The rook now vacates the third rank, a crucial step to potentially activate the bishop on the queen side, but this position is a mess of dangling pawns and isolated pieces for black. The rook's repositioning here is about establishing dominance on the open file, a key piece of business in this endgame where pawn structures are so fractured. The black king, having found temporary sanctuary on the light squares, now ventures into the center, a risky maneuver as the white rook eyes the now weakened third rank, potentially setting up a dangerous infiltration. Finally, black's king finds itself isolated on the back rank, a prime target for the rook's infiltration after this bishop repositioning. The pawn push here seeks to create counterplay, but it might be a bit slow to awaken the slumbering pieces and lacks immediate tactical urgency, potentially allowing the opponent to consolidate their gains and exploit the exposed king. Prying open the kingside is the immediate goal, forcing the black king into the uncomfortable embrace of the rook. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal prepares to contest the crucial f-file, a vital pathway for the white king's eventual endgame exposure. Clearing the rank with the rook creates a pivotal moment, opening a direct line to pressure the opponent's vulnerable pawn chain and potentially disrupting their queenside structure while simultaneously preparing for a counterthrust on the central files. The black king, having wandered from safety, now finds itself a beacon of vulnerability, a stark contrast to the potential for material gain if it could only reach a more secure square. The rook's journey to the f-file creates immediate pressure, seeking to exploit the exposed black king and potential weaknesses around the weakened pawn structure. Relocating the king to centralize it is a prudent choice, aiming to shield it from further attack while preparing to support pawn advances. The rook slides to the open file, a classic repositioning to exert pressure and contest control, potentially setting up a decisive infiltration. Pushing the h-pawn here is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it sacrifices valuable time and king safety by weakening the dark squares around your monarch, which white can now exploit with their active pieces. Unleashing the rook to the queen side now aims to exploit the open file and potentially support the isolated passed pawn. The pawn's determined march forward is an attempt to create a passed pawn, but it overlooks the immediate danger of being unhinged by the rook's pressure on the file. Capturing the pawn on a 6 unleashes the rook's power, now freed from its defensive duties to pursue the black king across the board. The black king, exposed and vulnerable after the rook's sacrifice, is now a target for the remaining white pieces. This repositioning aims to bring the king back towards the center, offering some slight protection, but the pawn chain on the kingside is shattered, leaving open avenues for white's persistent rook and knight. Reinforcing the bishop's outpost on d6 significantly restricts black's active piece play and prepares to exploit the weakened light squares around the king as the game progresses toward the endgame. The knight's surprising check injects a surge of tactical energy into the endgame, forcing the opposing king out of its relatively safe central position and potentially opening lines for further material gains if the king isn't carefully defended. Reasserting king's safety proves paramount after that surprising knight sacrifice. Bringing the monarch back towards the center offers a more secure refuge from black's active pieces. A desperate attempt to exploit the momentarily exposed king, but the pawn structure is far too solid to offer any real hope for a swift checkmate here. The king's final safety net unravels as white repositions, seeking to solidify his monarch against the persistent threats emanating from black's active bishop. The bishop delivers a sharp check, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially expose its weaknesses further. The king's final flight to safety is secured, anticipating black's desperate attempts to activate their bishop on the queen side. The bishop retreats, a tactical regrouping designed to shield the king from the aggressive rook's advance along the open file. Opening the file now creates immediate pressure on black's scattered pieces, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the king side with aggressive rook incursions. Injecting life into the position, the king bravely advances, seeking refuge and potential activity in the center, a gamble that could either solidify his safety or expose him to further skirmishes. Securing the king is paramount now that black's powerful bishop is somewhat neutralized, aiming to avoid any sudden back-rank threats or pesky knight forks. Retreating the bishop to g7 might seem passive, but it prepares to contest the open h-file, aiming to frustrate white's pawn push and potentially create counterplay if white's king feels exposed. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop, this move aims to create persistent pressure on the queenside pawns and disrupt black's pawn structure. Consolidating the bishop's defensive post on the f6 square reinforces the pawn structure and offers a more robust shield for the king, aiming to survive the immediate pressure. Dislodging that inconvenient bishop from its secure spot on g7 is paramount for activating white's own pieces, particularly the rook on h3, and opening avenues towards black's ultimately exposed monarch. The bishop, having completed its circuit around the king's flank, now seeks a new resting place on g7, a familiar square from earlier in the game, hinting at a desire to bolster the king's defenses once more amidst the encroaching white forces. The rook repositions itself, a seemingly passive redeployment, yet it subtly prepares for a future raid down the third rank should black's king continue its dance from the safety of the central squares. Embracing the pawn sacrifice on c3 presents a fascinating, albeit potentially risky, attempt to reignite black's activity in this rather static position, seeking to disrupt white's seemingly impenetrable pawn structure and open new lines for counterplay, even if it means sacrificing material for initiative. Unleashing a decisive check, the rook on g1 immediately forces the black king into a more exposed position, paving the way for a swift conclusion and highlighting the critical lack of defensive coordination around the black monarch. Pushing the king to meet the rook's challenge, a bold gamble to disrupt the mating net, though it opens new avenues for white's queenside threats. The king emerges from hiding, a bold gambit to solidify the queenside pawns and prepare for a decisive endgame push. Pushing the pawn forward creates a new advanced threat, aiming to disrupt white's currently passive rook and potentially open new avenues of attack on the queenside. Unleashing the rook onto the open file immediately targets the pinned pawn and prepares for potential queen activity, a crucial step in simplifying the position and forcing black's hand. Sensing a glimmer of hope, black's bishop repositions to contest the open files, aiming to disrupt white's carefully orchestrated pressure and perhaps find some counterplay. The king ventures out from its protective pawn shield, aiming to become an active participant in the unfolding endgame skirmish. Embracing the open files with the king, black seeks to exploit the exposed position of white's monarch and disrupt any coordinated defensive efforts, aiming to create active counterplay in this complex endgame. The rook's relocation to the first rank initiates a decisive sequence, leveraging the open file to spearhead a decisive king hunt. Suddenly the king is exposed, a lonely wanderer in the chaos, and the rook on e1, empowered by the recent pawn sacrifice, now glares menacingly down the open file, creating immediate, tangible pressure. Securing the important outpost with the bishop prevents black from further harassing the rook on the open file. Unlocking a new avenue for the rook to sweep across the board, this advance challenges the white king's safety and aims to disrupt the carefully placed defensive structure. Unleashing a surprising diagonal threat, the bishop repositioning aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn shield and potentially exploit the open lines that have materialized. Eliminating the last defender of the white king opens a path for the black rook to cause havoc on the newly accessible diagonal. Pushing the king forward now is about exploiting the opened lines and the opposition he's about to gain on the light squares, aiming to shuffle the black king to a less active position before the pawns on the queen side become a real threat. The bishop's repositioning to the long diagonal offers a new attacking perspective, potentially creating a discovered attack on the king or bolstering control over the central squares. This move aims to regain control of the c-file, threatening to dislodge black's remaining rook and potentially open lines against the king. Activating the king from its passive corner position aims to solidify the pawn majority on the queen side and perhaps initiate a counterattack. Activating the king is paramount in this endgame scenario, allowing it to actively participate in controlling crucial squares and supporting the remaining pawns as they advance. A tactical oversight by black allows white to finally consolidate their queenside pawns and create a clear path to victory. The king ventures out from its secure harbor, initiating the final maneuvers of this intricate endgame, aiming to corner the opposition's stubborn bishop. Unleashing the bishop to c2 revitalizes black's pieces and threatens to outflank white's position on the queen side, creating dynamic counterplay that could disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure.